Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Barry Pavel. I'm a Senior Vice President here, and I'm Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. And it's my pleasure to kick off today's discussion that'll dig into the issues and recommendations contained in the latest report from the Scowcroft Center, Reenergizing Transatlantic Space Cooperation, Opportunities in Security and Beyond. Here in the Scowcroft Center, we work hard to develop sustainable nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and our allies. The Center honors General Scowcroft's legacy of service and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security and support for U.S. leadership and cooperation with allies and partners and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. Our Transatlantic Security Initiative in the Scowcroft Center applies this ethos to addressing the most pressing issues on the transatlantic agenda, and certainly expanding cooperation in space security is a rapidly growing focus of this type of work. Today's event is part of the Council's Defense Industrial Policy Series, run by Scowcroft Center Senior Fellow Steve Grundman, and this series is a platform for senior government executives in defense and aerospace to address the public policies that shape the market for defense goods and services. By engaging the perspective of government leaders about issues at the interface of defense organizations and industries, this series aims to cultivate a constituency for practical solutions to these challenges. I'd like to very much thank our partner, Airbus, for their longstanding and generous support of the Council's Scowcroft Center. Many of them are here today. Thank you, and especially to those of you who've traveled a long way to be here. Very many thanks to Mr. Jaffert and Mr. Deaver, Mr. Gann, and the whole Airbus team. 2019 has certainly been a landmark year for space security. Last month, the Department of Defense activated U.S. Space Command, a new combatant command focused on space, intended to serve as a precursor to a future U.S. Space Force. Earlier this summer, NATO defense ministers agreed to the alliance's first ever policy for space, and at this year's NATO leaders meeting taking place in London in December, at which the Atlantic Council will be quite present. The alliance is set to declare space an official domain of operations alongside air, land, sea, and cyberspace. These actions by the United States and its NATO allies hammer home just how important space security issues have become. But these decisions alone do not mean the United States and its allies have mastered all the challenges in this domain. There's a lot of work to do. We'll hear about that quite a bit today. Space is certainly an increasingly congested and contested domain. Great power competition is playing out in force in space, with potential adversaries taking increasing steps to challenge the presence of the United States and its allies. And in this environment, it certainly is more important than ever for the transatlantic community to find ways to work together in this critical domain and ensure our security well into the future as it continues to evolve. Today, we are really lucky to be joined by a distinguished group of experts from both sides of the Atlantic to discuss these increasingly important issues from the perspective of both governments as well as industry, and this will need to be a partnership as our efforts to strengthen security go along. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to Dr. Scott Pace, Executive Secretary for the U.S. National Space Council, who will set the stage for our conversation today with keynote remarks. Dr. Pace is one of the United States' leading experts on space and technology, having served as director of the Space Policy Institute at George Washington University and in positions with NASA, the White House Office of Science and Technology, and the RAND Corporation. Dr. Pace was nominated in 2017 by President Trump to serve as Executive Secretary of the National Space Council. And the Council works to streamline and coordinate the United States space policy. Dr. Pace, thank you very much for being here, taking time out of your very busy calendar also. Before turning the microphone over to Dr. Pace, I would like to invite all of you to join the conversation on social media by following @Atlantic Council and the Scowcroft Center account @AC Scowcroft and using the hashtag AC Defense. I will certainly be there. Please join me as well. And with that, Dr. Pace, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Barry. Very kind of you. I understand you're the Arnie Cantor chair, which is particularly wonderful in that Arnie was a colleague and friend at RAND and learned a lot from him. So I just really think it's ideal to be introduced by you. So first of all, it's great to be with you here today on a topic of Reenergizing Transatlantic Space Cooperation. On behalf of the President and the Vice President and the National Space Council, really would like to thank the Atlantic Council for hosting this event and for inviting me to be here with you. In a speech last year on the future of the United States military in space, the Vice President observed, quote, "The space environment has fundamentally changed in the last generation. What was once peaceful and uncontested is now crowded and adversarial. Today, other nations are seeking to disrupt our space-based systems and challenge American supremacy in space as never before. For many years, nations from Russia and China to North Korea and Iran have pursued weapons to jam, blind, disable our navigation and communication satellites via electronic attacks from the ground. Both China and Russia have been conducting highly sophisticated on-orbit activities that could enable them to maneuver their satellites into close proximity with ours, posing unprecedented new dangers to our space systems," unquote. So the challenges of a changing space environment are intrinsically global and not limited to that of the Atlantic Alliance. The task for transatlantic space security cooperation is, in a phrase, how to think globally and act locally. Those engaged in this discussion should think beyond mere geography or even shared history to consider common values that we wish to see thrive in the space domain. And those are the values, I think, that the Atlantic Alliance shares. Space activities in Europe, like many things, are complex, and there are activities at national agencies, those of multinational organizations such as the European Space Agency, EUMETSAT, which predate the European Union and are the bases for many vital civil space partnerships with the United States. More recently, there have been space projects of the European Union, and soon an agency for the EU space program. So looking beyond the signature projects of Galileo and Copernicus, which I know many of you are familiar with, we believe the European Union could benefit from developing a clearer vision for space security policy, inclusive of emerging technical developments that reflect a common political vision for the role of the EU in space and defense in particular. And I know people are hard at work at that. If successful, the EU could begin to develop a coordinated approach to mitigating space security threats in concert with other state and non-state actors who share common interests and values with Europe. The United States enjoys productive bilateral agreements with the European nations such as France and Germany, no surprise, for space situational awareness and defense. However, the lack of a consolidated EU space security perspective could lead to gaps in our approach with member nations on space matters. And so we look forward to discussions with the new European Commission and the EU External Action Service on possible opportunities for closer cooperation over the next decade. The United States also welcomes NATO's approval of its first overarching space policy earlier this year, and we hope to continue maturing this foundational effort with well-defined input from member nations. The United States is actively participating in deliberations with the other 28 NATO allies on the implementation of overarching space policy, and we look forward to further statements on space issues at the next NATO summit this December in London. Now, from a U.S. perspective, the overarching NATO space policy can reinforce U.S. bilateral and multilateral engagements to foster a conducive international environment, including promotion of burden sharing and marshaling cooperative threat responses, all things in line with our security strategies. Like our other allies, we believe that individual NATO nations will continue to deliver and support unique space capabilities, and at the same time, NATO space policy can contribute to the alliance's ability to deter threats and contribute to collective self-defense against emerging space threats. Looking ahead, there may be opportunities for NATO and the EU to coordinate the development of space capabilities. This coordination can build upon recent efforts to advance the NATO-EU strategic partnership in other areas and ensure complementarity of effort. If properly structured, notice the diplomatic phrasing here, these NATO-EU partnerships could help enhance our common security in outer space, contribute to the transatlantic burden sharing, help deliver needed capabilities, and support an overall increase in defense spending. It's worth noting that the 2016 and 2018 NATO-EU joint declarations emphasized that capabilities developed through EU defense initiatives in NATO should remain coherent, complementary, and interoperable, as well as available to both organizations. Perhaps more importantly, the declarations encourage the fullest possible involvement of NATO allies that are not members of the EU in the EU's defense initiatives. The principles of these joint declarations also apply to the security and dual-use elements of the European space program, including GovSatcom and space surveillance and tracking. A disparity in requirements for interoperability and security accreditation between NATO and EU space capabilities would result in a disparity, we believe, in outcomes, not the desired coherence of output. In our multilateral engagements on space matters, the United States, along with our G7 partners, continue to encourage the development of norms of behavior in outer space that foster and contribute to expanding freedom of access and the use of space for all nations. At the same time, the United States will be consistent in holding to our policy of avoiding binding agreements and industrial policies that constrain American innovation. Without careful attention, such agreements and policies have the potential to choke off rapid innovation in space commercialization while allowing less principled nations, not necessarily in Europe, to expand their influence in the growing commercial space sector. And while the United States will continue to lead global efforts in the commercialization of space, we routinely remind our friends and allies that our security investment in space is vital to national interests that extend well beyond a single terrestrial area of responsibility. We will continue to support deployed forces in the Middle East and around the planet via space-enabled capabilities, while focusing on continued modernization of our systems in response to Russia and the rapid rise of China as relevant and potentially threatening space powers. The United States will continue to seek commercial partnerships with European industries to equip our emerging space force with the latest technology and capabilities. However, the terms of those partnerships need to be mutually beneficial to both parties and lead to reciprocal programs in future years. As leader of the space domain for defense, the United States will continue to share data, information, benefits of outer space investments with our European partners. However, the United States also remains bound to remind our friends and allies of their commitment to spend a minimum of 2% of the GDP on defense, with at least 20% of the defense spending devoted to force modernization, a critical priority, which can include force multipliers such as space capabilities. As stated in our national security strategy, we've returned to an era of great power competition. American investments in space exploration and development are investments in the diverse strengths of our nation and those of our friends and allies, including the essential values of the rule of law, democracy, economic freedom, human rights that we wish to see thrive in the space domain. Space is a shared domain in which the United States is critically dependent. As we look at that shared domain, we look at Chinese behavior in particular in other shared domains such as the South China Sea and cyberspace. It's given us pause for concern. Looking to space, it's hard to imagine China will behave any better than they behaved in other areas. And therefore, a stable international order, which obviously we desire, is something the Chinese and the Russians have challenged and are challenging in space. And Europe is neither exempt nor isolated from these trends. And so if humanity is to have a future in space, it should be a future in which space is the home of peoples and nations that share, or at least respect our common values. And as President Kennedy said in addressing the Congress in 1961, in his famous phrase, "Space is open to us now, and our eagerness to share its meaning is not governed by the efforts of others. We go into space because whatever mankind must undertake, free men must fully share." And of course, we would modify that today to say, of course, free men and women. And with that, I'd like to invite Tim Deaver from Airbus Defense and Space to the stage, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Dr. Pace, thanks for the outstanding keynote. As usual, you gave us many great thoughts to think about as we go through tonight. I'm Tim Deaver, Director of Space Programs here for Airbus U.S. Space and Defense. Noticed a little twist on the name, so that was an official name change about 10 days ago. It's to focus on our new strategy here in the U.S. for advancing the space capabilities here. We at Airbus truly appreciate what the North Atlantic Council does in promoting constructive and leadership and engagement in all the international affairs they're involved in. We share the view of the importance of the transatlantic relationship, especially when it comes to space, and more broadly, the key role is taken in meeting global challenges. Today's topic, Reenergizing Transatlantic Space Cooperation and Security and beyond, is of particular interest to Airbus. Our vision in space is simply to make space a universe of possibilities for everyone. With every technological breakthrough, we bring people closer together, we navigate new frontiers, and we discover new and unexplored destinations. And we just don't take innovations to space, but also our space solutions and projects help solve global problems here on Earth. We are proud partners of many transatlantic commercial and civil cooperative arrangements, ranging from the International Space Station, James Webb Telescope, and the return to Moon and onto the Mars by supplying the power and propulsion element of the Orion spacecraft. We strongly believe that the types of exchanges and papers that will be discussed today are an important component of moving this cooperation into the national security area. We find ways to cooperate on some of the most sensitive aircraft programs, like the F-35. Why can't we find those same ways to cooperate in national security space? So we are very excited about today's topic and very much look forward to the discussions that will ensue. But first, I'd like to provide a brief introduction for the author of today's paper and a good friend of mine, Steve Ganote. You have a more extensive background in your papers, but let me give you a little bit of high level introduction here. Steve Ganote is the managing director at Avocent, where he leads its space practice. Prior to that current position, Steve was with Booz & Company, Booz Allen Hamilton, with their aerospace and defense practice, as well as Intelsat, 360 Networks, and ComSat Corporation. He began his career as a legislative assistant to the United States Senator Barbara Mikulski and advanced advising on business, trade, and finance issues. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I introduce Steve Ganote.
Thank you, Tim, very much. Let me make sure this is working. Not yet, but we'll figure it out. There we go. The first thing I want to do is first, you heard from Scott and you heard from Tim about how much more important space is getting. What we were looking to do with our white paper, which all of you have, is talk a little bit about the transatlantic piece of this and areas where cooperation make more sense. So that's what we'll be talking about in a second. And this paper was to set up this panel discussion and make sure that we have an open dialogue. So luckily we'll be getting to a panel very shortly. The first thing we want to do is, he mentioned me as the author. I am a small author, even though my name's at the top. Janie, Diana, and Connor, if you could please stand up. They did a lot of work on this paper and a lot of great research, and want to thank them for all that. The first slide is to reiterate what Scott was saying, that space is that much more important than it ever was. And what's happened just in the last 5-6 years is you've got a doubling of the number of countries with on-orbit assets. You've got countries as diverse as Vietnam and Bhutan coming into space, Bangladesh putting assets on orbit, Nigeria. You also have a very robust commercial space sector growing outside of the normal US, Russia, Ukraine, European arc, with China probably the most active space country if you look at change over the last 2 or 3 years, both, and we'll talk about this a little bit, both in government areas, but also commercially. So privately funded commercial launch in China, privately funded commercial satellites. So there's a lot going on in space, and space is integral to so many missions now. You don't talk about space and terrestrial missions, you talk about a mission. So you talk about GPS, or you talk about your cell phone, or you talk about, you think about Uber, one of the most highly valued companies in the world right now. They don't exist without GPS. GPS is space, right? So if you think about how space is now woven into our economies, you can double that in terms of how it's woven into national security. And certainly we saw with Hurricane Dorian, and we see all the time, the security is not just military, right? It can be weather. It can be pretty much any range of things. It can be keeping and separating air traffic now, which used to be all ground and now is moving to space and satellite. So as space is growing and diversifying and barriers to entry are lowering, right? The cost of launch to space, we just heard from SpaceX, they'll do a launch for $2 million for a given satellite as part of a ride share. That's $2 million for launches that used to be $100 million or more. just a few years ago. So it's easier to get in space. There are more folks going there, more countries going there. It certainly means it's time to start thinking about how we're managing and governing space. So we'll talk about that in just a second. One of the things we looked at with the challenge, right, and this is something that we talked about internally, we talked about space cooperation. We broke it into 3 areas: civil, commercial, and national security. And we looked back and we looked at, these are just a few examples, but if you look at the ability to cooperate across the Atlantic in space, it's been very pronounced in civil and commercial areas, especially civil, and much less pronounced in national security. And we talk about that in the white paper, and if you get a chance to read it this week, you'll see that it's a combination of the inherent desire to protect your military secrets and protect your military operations, but also habits that fall in around national security. But certainly we've seen a much greater level of cooperation from, whether it's Space Lab, we talk about Intelsat, a place I used to work. It was funded as an intergovernmental consortium in 1964. So it says commercial. It really wasn't commercial back then. But that was an example of a global enterprise to bring communications to the world, where a lot of countries relied on that one system for all of their international communications. And that's how internet cooperation was started in communications. Certainly in civil, with Space Lab and Skylab, the Hubble Telescope, Space Station, you've seen a long history of cooperation, relatively frictionless compared to military and national security. If we think about all those space missions, and Scott did a very nice job of raising the potential threats that are out there, we wanted to scare you a little bit with how easy it is to shoot down a satellite. So we got Connor, Diane, and Janie got pictures for us. So if you look at what Russia can or is rumored to be able to do, we talked about essentially a ghost sat that will park itself right next to a commercial satellite. There's a discussion that seems to have happened with an Intelsat satellite a couple of years ago. There's the old Moonraker idea, if you remember, a satellite eating another satellite in the James Bond movie. That's possible, but what's also possible, and has been shown just as recently as this year with India, 2007 with China, you can shoot down satellites. You can put a missile, you shoot a missile up to low Earth orbit, which is generally a few hundred to a couple thousand kilometers above the Earth. So from here to Florida, not that hard to shoot straight up, or to geostationary, which is 22,000 miles away. It's a lot further, but the belief is it's doable, and we're showing you the DN2, the Chinese weapon that's rumored to be able to do that. So all of these assets that we've put in space and all of the reliance we've built up could be threatened in any number of ways militarily. And we've got to, and you'll see both Florence Parly and Betty Sapp pretty much saying the same thing, is we have to act and we have to change. And when Scott talks about the Space Force and he talks about Space Command, that's in part a realization that space has to be thought of as a distinct area that's not buried into any other discussion, but we really have to pay attention in a way that we never have before to the threats. So this is one flavor of threat. The other flavor is inadvertent, right? So you potentially have a military actor that wants to disrupt by jamming or by kinetic action, but you also have essentially self-congestion, and that's congestion of physical assets in space and debris and coordinating that. And we've got probably a half dozen viable constellations of hundreds to thousands or 10,000 plus assets that will be deployed in space by new commercial ventures. Managing those can be very difficult. And if you think about a congested arc, if you're not able to deorbit your system, what you put up in space stays there indefinitely. And one of the frustrations that you certainly heard from a lot of folks around the world in the Indian test is it's okay to shoot down your own satellite. That doesn't bother us so much. What bothers us is the 250 pieces of space debris that came out of that, or the 500 or 1,000 that came out of the Russian ASAT test, or when a Russian satellite that was deorbited 10 years ago, 15 years ago, ran into an Iridium satellite and took it offline. Luckily, Iridium had 77 satellites in orbit, so it could backfill that. But you've got increasing number of things in space that can run into each other. And a lot of those things in space are not controllable. So you have to identify those and manage around that. And you can see on the right side there, the number of pieces of space debris in orbit is growing extremely quickly, and that curve will only increase given the number of satellites going up in space. And God forbid, were there a war in space and 10, 20, 100 satellites were taken out, the debris issue would get extreme and severe. So on that cheery note, we wanted to go back to, is there a need, right? The need is clear to cooperate better to address these threats. And there are different ways to do it in both civil and in military areas. And as we looked at it, we were seeing that the civil partnerships that have been developed, Scott and Tim were alluding to them as well, there's a lot of cooperation going on there. It can be better, but most of that cooperation probably needs to turn to things like managing space debris, radio frequency interference, which is the lifeblood of a satellite transmission, and making sure that there isn't self-jamming, that we're not inadvertently creating orbits or debris paths that are going to threaten our ability to execute on space missions. In military space, the cooperation is very clear that there needs to be more. It's very difficult, right? When you've got 26, 30, 20 NATO countries or other allied countries trying to coordinate to one policy, that's very difficult. Even in the US, it's difficult enough. Creating the scars around Space Force and Space Command are example enough. But there's an urgent need to be thinking about how we cooperate better, and we'll talk about that in just a second. And on the commercial side, the main role that governments can play is to try to modernize as quickly as the industry is modernizing. With the billions of dollars of private capital going into the space industry that were never going before, it's time that we start thinking about what we can do to upgrade. For example, we'll talk about ITAR policy and do that on a schedule that is not 5 years or a decade, but maybe every year. So for the discussion, and this is purely meant to set up the discussion, we wanted to make sure that we talk about three main areas. The first is resiliency. And resiliency is just making sure that what we have in terms of serving a mission with space can be maintained. And we've seen some very good, like GPS Galileo coordination and backup is a fundamental thing and very important and very useful. The US was not so comfortable with Galileo a few years ago. We're much more comfortable now as we start to think about the threats to space. But it's time that we start, especially in the Transatlantic Alliance, start thinking about how do we start building in resiliency from the design early on as opposed to thinking about it after the fact, right? So that's one challenge that we have. We think about actually operating satellites and executing missions and building you can build resiliency into a system, but if you don't operate that system clearly or coherently, it's not going to work the way you want it to. So what we're recommending, and we believe, is that it's important to start thinking about space as distinct from air, distinct from ground, and treating the space cooperation and space mission as unique as it is, even if it's integrated and integral to a ground mission. And we've got to start thinking about the Schriever War Games, the Space Flag Games, the CSPOC, where allies in the US together jointly operate satellites. We've got a very good start there, but we really need to step up our game. We are nowhere near as good at space war games as we are at air or naval or combined force war games. So we really want to think about how can we do more in space and how do we encourage this. And one way to encourage it is to think about, it was mentioned earlier, the 2% defense contribution to NATO and the modernization contribution. One way to start thinking about that is we're starting to get more hybrid European space assets, right? And we have governments, we have GovSat with Luxembourg, we have new missions that are both government-driven and bought by the government operated, but also commercially operated shared satellites. And we can start thinking about how a government contribution to that satellite might go toward that NATO 2% target or might go toward that modernization target if it serves and when it serves a strong and compelling defense mission and national security mission. So the third piece, as we think about operations and we think about resiliency, is to start thinking about our commercial industrial base and the supply chain. And we actually have a very integrated, the graphic here doesn't show as well, but if you think about the Iridium Next satellites that were just deployed this year on SpaceX satellites that were built by Thales Alenia and Khan, integrated by Northrop Grumman / Orbital ATK in Arizona, and represented a truly global supply chain with very strong transatlantic ties, with componentry that is, if not equal, pretty close to 50-50, 60-40 US and European. And you see the same thing going on with the Airbus OneWeb satellites, right? And Tim, something that's very close to Tim's heart, where you've seen the manufacturing in France and a new facility for manufacturing the next generation of OneWeb satellites in Florida, and then the launch that just took place on a Russian Soyuz. So you see a true kind of integrated supply chain there. But we have ITAR regulations, a munitions list, where the State Department is still treating technology that, one of the numbers we came up with was 96% of Allied requests for approval to get technology exported gets approved. Okay, well, if it's 96%, maybe we can expedite that process and maybe we can review for that. So what we most wanted to do, though, is just make sure that our governments, as we're talking about military and we're talking about civil cooperation, are thinking just as aggressively about not slowing our commercial sector as the Chinese and other economies are growing their space investment and growing their commercial capability. Because frankly, a lot of our strength and a lot of our ability to excel in national security space comes from a vibrant commercial sector. So we want to make sure we don't lose that. With that, we're going to turn it over to the panel and step down. Thank you.
Thank you.
Today, I'm Jacqueline.
Oh.
I'm on now.
Keep talking about fixing.
I'm Jacqueline Felcher. I'm a national security and space reporter at Politico. And to start off with, I'd just like to thank the Atlantic Council for putting together this great event and to all of you for being here today. We've gotten a lot of really good kind of background setting for today's conversation, but I'm going to do just a little bit of my own before I turn it over to the panel. The Pentagon now openly calls space a warfighting domain, which is something that really would have been unheard of years ago. And at the same time that space is getting more contested and congested, the world is also becoming more reliant on space, from Uber to precision agriculture that impacts the food chain to the timing signals that keep the world's economic system running. The Pentagon is looking for ways to better respond to these growing threats, things like US Space Command and the potential Space Force. But partnerships are also a key way to combat these growing threats. And while security cooperation between the US and Europe has existed for decades, working together in space poses unique challenges that we're going to get into today. So I'm going to give just brief introductions of our stellar panel. Everyone has their full bios in the agenda. We're joined by Stephen Katay, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, Jean-Luc Bald, the first Secretary of Space at the delegation of the European Union to the United States, Laurent Giffard, a space strategist and Vice President of Business Development for Airbus Defense and Space, Bob Canty, the Vice President of Constellation Management and Protection at Raytheon Space and Airborne Systems, and Stephen Ganote, who you've already heard from, who wrote this paper we're here to talk about today. So to start off with, I'd like to invite each of our panelists to make a brief opening statement with their thoughts on some of the threats we face today and the best way that partnerships can help fix them, if you'd like to start.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm Stephen Katay. As Jacqueline mentioned, thank you for that introduction. Thank you to the Atlantic Council. I see Steve Gruberman up here in the front who organized this, to Avicent for doing that excellent report, and for all of you for being here. This is an extremely exciting time for our nation's space program. And partnerships are going to be a key element of our success in an era of great power competition in space. If we zoom out, you'll hear some familiar themes here. Of course, I'll be speaking from the perspective of the Department of Defense, but really we're at a strategic inflection point for space. And that inflection point, we look at the reliance that we have on space systems at an all-time high and expanding. This is both for our way of war and our way of life. And then we look at the threats that we're facing in the space domain. Those are correspondingly at an all-time high and expanding. The threats are real, serious, and growing. China and Russia in particular are pursuing counter space capabilities, which are serious, and the department is really preparing to make sure that we can respond to these threats. So when we look at the macro sense, and as was mentioned earlier by Stephen, the world is changing, and the Department of Defense needs to change with it. And that change is this change to preparing from space not only as a support function, but space as a domain which we have to look at deterrence, competition, and be prepared to assure and protect and defend our capabilities. So this is the transformation that's happening, and it really is a profound change for the Department of Defense, because what this means is that actions in space, not just terrestrially, will impact the outcome of future conflict or crisis. And we can no longer just think about sending satellites into space, and as was mentioned earlier, and not be thinking about key concepts like resiliency and preparing for that at the start of the programs. A key element of these changes, as was mentioned, is the United States Space Command. This was established as the 11th Combatant Command, focused on deterrence and operations. The next is the Space Development Agency, and this is an agency focused on providing capabilities rapidly to our warfighters. And then the Space Force. We have a strategic imperative to establish the Space Force as the 6th branch of our armed forces. And the Space Force will be focused on the capabilities, the people, and doctrine of this domain. Of course, as was mentioned, that's now in Congress's hands, and we'll see what legislation comes out on that. There's also new energy on partnerships. In the past, space was a domain of relatively few actors, and as we've heard, that has also changed. So the U.S., not only does the U.S. depend on space for its security and its way of life, but so do our allies and partners. And in other domains, air, land, and sea, we've learned to work together in coalitions. And different countries bring different capabilities, different authorities, different people to those coalitions. But what is common is a common vision. That's what we need in space, because we need to develop that common vision because we do share a common threat. So we have a lot of work that we have ahead of us. We've made great progress, and I look forward to talking more about that through the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. I'm Jean-Luc Ball from the EU delegation in the United States here in Washington, D.C. Thank you to the Atlantic Council for setting up the panel and giving us the opportunity to discuss this important subject. I like to start out, the paper references sometimes Europe, sometimes the European Union, and Europe covers different actors. It's true in space, it's true everywhere. So in space, we have the member states, we have the European Space Agency, and the European Union. Each one has a different strategy and different objectives. I will offer the perspective of the European Union from the panel. We, at the EU level, are dependent on space because we do space as a means towards an end, serving our citizens. Space has become an integral part of implementing the European Union's policies, agricultural policy, environment policy, border protection, etc. We are a relatively new actor, but we have had some significant achievements in the meantime, and we are poised to do more. So what I want to do in this short introduction is send an optimistic message. The stage is set for greater cooperation between the US and the EU in the space domain for the years to come. First, because as I said, the EU is now a capable actor in space. In 8 years, we've come from paper capabilities to actual global navigation satellite services and remote sensing with 33 satellites in orbit. And even though there are civilian programs under civilian control, there is existing and potential cooperation in the security domain. Galileo provides global satellite navigation, positioning, and timing services since 2016. We have an agreement with the US since 2004. It ensures the interoperability and compatibility between Galileo and GPS. The US has requested access to our governmental service, the Public Regulated Service, which is a robust encrypted signal for use by governmental authorities. It will make us both more resilient. Which other global system would you want to partner with in the current state? In remote sensing, Copernicus has become a leading program in sustainable Earth observation. It provides 6 families of services. One of them is the security service with maritime surveillance, border protection, and support to EU external action via the EU Satellite Center. But that's not all. We have a useful and intense cooperation on the civil security side with the Federal Emergency Management Agency. FEMA has activated Copernicus for flood mapping during hurricanes 6 times in the last few years. And this has been a very fruitful cooperation on both sides, and we're now moving to the next stage, which is working together on algorithms to improve our capabilities, to save lives and property. So we're really improving security not only in space, but also on Earth. Second, I'm optimistic because there's more in store for the EU. The EU has been taking an enhanced role in space for the last 20 years. Its role is set to expand in the close future. The current European Commission has launched the European Defence Fund for research and development. The next commissioner who will take office on the 1st of November, Mrs. Sylvie Goulard from France, will be in charge of space and of defense industries. And her mandate includes developing, promoting synergies between both. We will have a space program with more money, 16 billion euros, plus 25%, which means more activities. Copernicus will include a stronger security dimension for border protection and maritime surveillance. The space program will integrate a new element, secure governmental satellite communications, and the space surveillance and tracking element will expand, and all of the speakers mentioned debris and surveillance of space as a critical issue. It will expand with the potential to develop projects under the European Defence Fund, so do a military dimension too. We therefore follow the work of the implementation of the Space Policy Directive 3 on space traffic management with much interest, because we believe there's much to be gained from closer cooperation between the US and Europe in this matter. And finally, because I'm optimistic because we need to work together also in the diplomatic space. Crowding and new actors calls for rules of the road. There has been a close call between the Airbus satellite of ESA and a SpaceX spacecraft not long ago. It reminded us of the risks out there. And in fact, even if something had happened, nobody would have infringed rules because there are no rules applicable there. The 21 long-term sustainability guidelines agreed in the United Nations framework are a great step forward, but they are guidelines, not rules. We need to move forward. Responsible behavior allowing for sustainable use of space is our duty vis-à-vis future generations. At the EU level, we pursue the 3 SOS initiative: safety, security, and sustainability of space activities. 3S, but also 3 times SOS, because the situation is urgent. We are not writing a code, but we're looking to engage with actors, governmental and non-governmental, to promote responsible and sustainable behavior in outer space. Many of these topics have been discussed during the 10th EU-US Space Dialogue in June in Prague. Developments on both sides, as you have heard, set the stage for more vigorous cooperation, and we're looking forward to doing more together. Thank you.
Thank you. Laurent, would like to.
So, thank you very much for the invitation. My name is Laurent Jaffar. I work for Airbus Defense and Space. I'm a French citizen based in Germany. My wife is from Dallas, Texas. And I've recently, in 2013, graduated from the National Defense University, the Eisenhower School. I'm representing here the industry. As an industrial player, we do recognize the strategic importance of space and the force multiplier. We do recognize the importance of providing superior knowledge to our customers, and we also recognize that there is a need for sovereignty and independence in having access to space assets. That does not necessarily mean that collaborations cannot be taking place. And as an industrial partner, we are eager to work with space companies across the pond. What we also see is there is a growing use of data derived from space. And this use is not just military use, but also commercial use. There is a lot of assets that are producing data, and not just navigation signal for Uber, but that are helping to increase the safety on the planet, and by this also helping to grow and sustain growth with the GDP. Space is a complex but a structured ecosystem. And we have across the Europe and across America very clear ways to work between governments and industry. There are different models that have been proven and working, such as public-private partnerships, to help finance and develop technology to mature and develop services for the good of our citizens and taxpayers. There's a growing number of space nations, but when you look at those space nations are relying on more or less the same actors providing the infrastructure. And those actors are mostly in the US and in Europe. Yes, we see Chinese investing, and yes, we see Chinese starting to export, but we have, as a partnership between Europe and the US, the ability to export our technologies and to create bilateral agreements with these new space nations. Space is for the benefit of mankind, and the issue of congestion and the issue of near collisions or collisions that has happened is a clear issue that we take very seriously as an industrial player. If we cannot use space any longer, we are out of business. So we have a duty to make sure that the quality of the spacecraft we are making, the quality of the launchers we are making, are at the best. And we are also having a duty when thinking about constellation to have a deorbiting concept from the beginning. Technology and technology partnership is key. Europe still relies very much on US technologies, and yes, we have to ask for export control licenses, but as an industrial player, these are the rules of the game, and we're playing by the rules. We understand that going to space helps us understand the world better, what's happening on the planet, but it is also helping our decision makers to take the right decisions. It is also an ability to communicate, to transfer knowledge, and there is a clear correlation between the ability to close the digital divide and the growth of GDP. Growth of GDP will go with more stability in the world, and we also have to look at it from that angle. Thank you.
I'm Bob Canty. I'm with Raytheon, and I'm going to take a slightly different tact here. So what I see driving the marketplace right now is really economic and resiliency reasons for kind of driving this partnership. If I take a look at the United States, they're not only investing in space domain awareness, they're investing in space protection. At the same time, we're modernizing all of our force enhancement programs like Global Positioning System, Missile Warning Communications, and GEOINT. So really, affordability really is a real driver for partnership, kind of across the board. I just want to kind of make a finer point on the space protection or the space domain awareness problem. So if you take a look at the space between geostationary orbit and the Earth's, the start of the space, that's 314 trillion cubic kilometers. And I'll give you a little bit of perspective. If you assume that that's the water in an Olympic-sized pool, all the oceans in the world would fit into a goldfish bowl. So that's the size of what we have to be looking at for things in space. By 2025, there's as many as 1,100 satellites being launched each year. That's up from about 365 in 2018. And if you just take a look at the space debris out there right now, estimates are about 128 million pieces of debris that are smaller than a marble, about 900,000 that are between the size of a marble and a baseball, and about 34,000 objects that are larger than a baseball, and that's increasing on an annual basis. So, it's really a daunting problem when you take a look at it. And the only way that's really going to be solved is using massive amounts of data coupled with artificial intelligence and machine learning to drive predictive analytics. And really the only way that's going to happen is partnerships with Europe, allied nations, and commercial entities. There's another reason for partnerships, which is really outside of resiliency, it's deterrence. So if you take a look at an interoperable coalition enterprise, negating one country's capability does not negate the coalition's enterprise. And to really take on the coalition enterprise, you'd have to make a significant amount of investment in resources and risk of taking action, because now you're involving partners and other nations. So I mentioned before the data layer is the key enabler. And at our business at Raytheon, our mission is trusted data to decisions to action, seamlessly across all domains, to protect nations and who defends it. Key elements of the data layer, which is really I focus on, this is where the rubber hits the road and how you make systems really interoperable, is really dealing with data standards, normalization, pedigree, releasability, and information assurance. And really given the classified nature of the information we're talking about, really defense contractors are really the best positions to integrate across the United States and Europe. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you guys all so much. It sounds like everyone agrees that more cooperation is needed. So I guess the big question I have from this is why is the cooperation not happening? What are the biggest challenges here to building more cooperation? Stephen, would you like to start?
So I'll start. So why is it not happening? I would kind of change that to say it is happening. We are making progress. There is a number of areas, whether it's talking about cooperation with space situational awareness agreements, of which U.S. Strategic Command, now U.S. Space Command, has over 100 space situational awareness agreements. 80 are with commercial companies. There's 22 with nations around the world. We do the Schriever War Games, which looks 10 years out at threats and conflict in the future. And we get together with the Five Eyes partners, as well as in certain years we have France, Germany, and Japan involved, which we talk about how would we respond to conflict extending into space. What capabilities are needed? What authorities are needed? How are we viewing things? But your point is well taken that we do need to do more, and this is a key priority. I had mentioned the era of great power competition, and the Department of Defense is really focused on implementing the National Defense Strategy, of which one of 3 lines of effort is partnerships. And I would say that the need to do more is really underpinned by that leadership focus of saying that this is an area that we really have to make change. And that allows us, and when we look at why it's potentially a problem or lags, is 1, it's complex, and 2, change is hard. It is difficult to change the systems in the Pentagon, for instance, to approach this problem in which a way that we've done it quite differently historically. So I've wrapped a few items in there insofar as we are making progress, we need to do more, it requires leadership attention, and really, change is hard, so we are going to have to continue to put a priority and attention on this area.
Jean-Luc, is there a top area where you see greater potential for more cooperation? Anything in particular?
I mean, you've heard the different speakers mentioning the issue of security in space. So whether intentional or unintentional threats to our spacecraft. Europe is complex. I mentioned it, and this is exactly where it rejoins that. Stephen has mentioned the 100 agreements with on SSA data sharing. These agreements are on a bilateral basis, as far as it concerns Europe, with France, Germany, UK, etc., the European Space Agency operators, but not with the EU. And this is also where I share his assessment that cooperation is happening, but will increase, because we're a relatively new actor in the domain. And SSA has been traditionally in the US and in Europe on the defense side. 5 years ago, we set up a framework program for space surveillance and tracking with a civilian front end, just trying to move that outside of the military domain to facilitate data sharing, greater openness, more access to commercial actors. We'll continue this program, and in parallel, I see the developments in the US setting up a civilian SSA operator with the Department of Commerce, and here I see great potential for cooperation, working on standards, exchanges, working on the open data repository, etc.
So we heard in Stephen's overview of his report that civil and commercial has really is an example of ways that good cooperation can happen. So Laurent, I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about maybe ways that lessons learned in industry on how to partner can maybe spill over into national security areas.
So I think that partnership on the industrial side is usually triggered by partnership between nations, either bilateral or multilateral. When we are able to have a frame program that sets the rules of the game, industry is very quick at defining what is the best way to play. The issues then rely on contractual vehicles, and the difference between the contractual vehicles in the US and the contractual vehicles we have in France. Cost plus in the US, firm fixed price in Europe for most of the cases. And then you have a different approach to risk, and you have a different approach to the ability to push technology. We believe that we have in our DNA this ability to embark into programs which are pushing technology forward. We believe that there are technologies that are in essence of dual use nature, in particular Earth observation. Optical is of use in the frame of national security, but also in the frame of economical growth for different countries. The NATO idea of pooling and sharing is something that nations can work further on, and also to look at how to credit what nations are doing towards this famous 2% is something that could be further developed.
So earlier, again, in the great overview of the report, that there was a recommendation for some sort of NATO policy for space or some sort of formal agreement on everything from space debris to information sharing, but that can be time consuming. So absent that, sort of in the interim while those formal processes are ongoing, Bob, I'm hoping you can talk a little about what industry can do in terms of best practices to cooperate more overseas.
So I would talk about it for what's happening today, which is when we get agreements in place and we want to go share data, it's all about how do you basically manage those interfaces, manage the information assurance, manage that overall data flow in the system itself. I would say the more agreements that we have on different aspects of it, like even if you're taking a different domain, like missile warning or whatever, is as soon as we have kind of agreements in place on what we're going to go share and how we're going to go share it, we have the mechanisms in place to go do that. So I think the pacing item is on the government side is really getting those agreements in place, because once you get that, the interfaces and how do you go data share becomes a lot easier. So, and I would just sit there and say, if you look at, as an example on the commercial side, if you're taking a look at space situation awareness data, it's very easy once you get a contracting mechanism in place to bring that data in, within days or weeks into the overall enterprise. So that's not the hardest part. The hardest part is actually getting the agreements in place.
So, Stephen, you've looked at this from a lot of different angles. What do you think it will take to actually spur more cooperation, whether it's the desire to pool resources or diplomatic relations? What do you think will be sort of the spur to get change here?
Well, I don't know if there's going to be any one spur, but a big problem tends to drive change, right? So another major orbital debris problem could drive a notable change in more proactive space traffic management, for example. I think that there has been, as we looked at it, there has been the oh crap moment within the U.S. government about how threatened our assets are. And our sense is that that's beginning to translate to fairly aggressive discussions about military resiliency and mission resiliency. It's still primarily within the we see it primarily within the U.S. military, but we see more engagement with Europe. And we had a conversation. The panel was together in a room before we started. And one of the issues that was raised was defining the problem clearly and maybe not too broadly. So if we take what Bob was just saying about the ability to share information, one of the suggestions we had was a whitelist of, hey, these are countries or topics where you're going to get expedited ability to share or use information. So that's kind of one way. The other thing is to look at successes and build on them. So if we look at the wideband global SATCOM, the WGS satellite system, which essentially became the U.S. government replacement to using Eutelsat and other Intelsat and other commercial assets because they didn't have enough to fight wars. They went to Iraq and they were short of capacity. We were short of capacity, and the coalition had to use 90% commercial capacity to fight those wars. WGS system comes on, Australia co-invests, and then that co-investment gets opened up to a number of European partners. again, on a more of a bilateral basis, coordinated, but it definitely is a success story about co-investment and accessing a very capable system more aggressively. You see that a little bit in discussion with the United Kingdom has the Skynet satellite system, which is for government, but also has a commercial component to it. So you're seeing good successes of cooperation that are government-driven, involve commercial actors, and involve international governments. But the next level is to focus on a specific problem and kind of roll with that.
So I'd like to talk quickly about classification levels and what impact those have on the ability to work both with international partners and with the commercial sector. There have been top leaders at the Pentagon who have talked about the need to declassify as much as possible or more on space. Stephen, can you weigh in on sort of what the Pentagon is thinking on that?
Sure. I had a feeling you might ask that, so I did bring some props. And I think this goes to the theme, and hopefully what people walk away from is just the changing nature of the domain. So when the domain is changing, we need to change other elements of it, and we need to think about how we're approaching security classification. Space, and we can kind of go through the history of space, but broadly speaking, it was very strategic when it started from a national security space perspective throughout the Cold War, and then really starting with the Gulf War, and then after 9/11, there was just this much greater integration into our tactical forces, where it was a tactical period, and now we're at the period now where is characterized both by space as a warfighting domain as well as this growing economic opportunity, which we can talk about more and we've kind of hit on. But with those changes and where we're at now, we do have to change our make sure that our security classification posture is keeping up with that. From one extent, it is ensuring that the capabilities we're developing, we are able to work with our allies and share the necessary thinking and the necessary capabilities and how we're approaching deterrence, how we are approaching resilience, how we're going to provide the necessary mission assurance and ensure that we can integrate with our allies and the commands. The second aspect is ensuring that we're able to talk with our allies and the American public about the threats. Because this is, as we said, the changing nature. And I just mentioned 2 documents that are out on the internet. And if you Google Space Force proposal, you'll find links to these 2 documents. One is a DIA report, and the other is a NASIC report. And these are over 60 pages of intelligence information that was put out at the unclassified level to talk in particular about Russia and China, their activities in space and counter space activities, to share much more to the public about what's going on in space.
So I think we have time for a few audience questions. If anyone can go right here in front. I think there'll be someone with a microphone. If you can just identify yourself.
Yeah, hold 1 second. There's a microphone coming to you.
Yes, Henry Sokolsky with the Non-Proliferation Policy Education Center. Working with the National Security Committee of the ABA, and one of the things that came up that I'd like to see if anyone has a view of is what the French are doing. Now, these folks seem to be Cartesian, and they talk about the need to worry about these co-orbital systems. They think this is urgent. They've talked about bodyguards, they've talked about zones. Are they ahead of us, or are they just off? Curious to get some comments. They seem to think this is important.
Is there
Even
anyone
though
who'd
the
like?
French, I'm afraid I have to decline because I can only represent the view of the EU and have no comment on the member states. Yeah.
So I'll take that from the Department of Defense perspective. The comments that were made by Madame Parley, and a quote was put up there earlier by Steve, they're significant. And again, not to beat this drum, but it does go to the changing nature of the domain. part of this is discussions that we have with our allies, both bilaterally, multilaterally, about talking about the nature of the domain and how we need to ensure that we are taking a posture to be able to assure these space systems throughout a conflict at the necessary levels to our warfighters, and be it, you know, our economy or other aspects. And when we think about mission assurance, there's really three aspects, and this can get into a deeper discussion on how the Department of Defense kind of views its taxonomy, looking at resiliency measures, defensive operations, and reconstitution, whereas we're actually bringing new capabilities online in a conflict. So, you know, I appreciate those comments. I think that it goes to show the gravity of the subject, and how really it's not just the United States that this conversation is happening, but it's also our allies, and that's important, and we are working really closely with them.
Yeah, I just pick up on that briefly and say that as we looked at it, we talked about this earlier today, you know, don't tell the French and don't tell the Americans, but they're very much aligned with each other on recognizing this threat and coming up with some ideas on how to deal with it, particularly carving out space from other domains and trying to deal with issues specifically in it. So it's a situation you don't always see, but to Stephen's point, it shows the importance of this issue as you really think through what you need to do with all of these assets and these missions that so much rely. And frankly, if you face a truly kinetic war and you're not able to use your space assets, that's a threat to thousands of lives, if not more. It's a very serious threat that we haven't faced yet, but folks are starting to wake up to.
Go right here.
Hi, I'm Teresa Hitchens with Breaking Defense. My question is about China. It seems to me that one of the key areas that separates Europe and the United States is different views on the value of civil cooperation in space with China as a lever to also help understanding in the security sphere. And what you're seeing is Europeans moving toward cooperation. That in turn creates potential problems for a U.S. that's focused on keeping China out of supply chains, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd like to hear some of the panel's views on how to deal with that critical problem.
I don't know if you're all looking at me, but so we have to choose as a European industry whether we want to work with the US or with China. I think for Airbus, we've made a clear choice. We want to work with the US. On scientific missions, there is potential avenues for cooperation. That does not mean technology transfer. That does not mean the transfer of pieces from one country to another. It's a question actually for maybe more for the governmental bodies. Why is China kept out of the ISS? And would that be an opportunity to actually initiate the dialogue?
Thank you, Teresa, for that question. And I don't want to speak for NASA or other departments or agencies, but the Department of Defense is very concerned with the supply chain integrity and the theft of intellectual property. And that extends to critical technologies in space, as well as many other areas of high technology in the United States, which make partnership a challenge.
Maybe to complete what my two colleagues just said, at the EU level, we have a tripartite dialogue on civil space limited to research. Together with ESA, we have a dialogue with China. And at the same time, at a larger level, the EU has published its strategy vis-à-vis China earlier this year, and we are working together, for example, with the US and Japan to ensure that we address the issues like intellectual property theft and other behaviors in multilateral fora. So there's a tension there, but we are working.
Any other questions? Go right down in the front here.
Thank you. Hi. Speaking of the French earlier, Jacob Markish with Thales North America. So, we, like our peers at Airbus, have a significant amount of technology and products capabilities to bring in the space domain. But clearly, from a national security perspective, there are some very serious limits on how much involvement we can have sometimes as a partner to folks like Raytheon, Northrop, others, or sometimes as a prime. So my question is, there's two flavors of limits, right? One is statutory and very black and white, which is to say access to classified information, foci mitigation, otherwise. And the other one arguably is more of a gray area, which is to say, which programs would realistically be awardable to a European contractor as a prime, no matter what foci mitigation, SSA, proxy, otherwise, that prime has. So my question is, what do you think are the realistic limits today, and do you think they might change going forward on the role that a European contractor like Thales or Airbus might have in a major and potentially a sensitive space program in the U.S.? Maybe my peers from the industry might try it first, and then we could hear from Stephen from a DoD perspective.
I mean, I would just sit there and say where we have partnerships really kind of comes down to, we talked about the classification, things being overclassified or classified at the right level. So if we can get the classification level at the right level, we have an opportunity to do more partnership with European countries. I think the classification restrictions are probably the biggest thing that hampers us from doing that, although we will bring in technology, commercial technology, other technology to solve our customers' problems. We just have to work that with them kind of in advance of the delivery of need, right? So if we have a GEOINT capability or some kind of capability we bring it to our customers, we just work that way in advance of being able to deliver that capability into our customers. So it's really the security aspect that slows us down there.
On the spacecraft side, I think that we have to stay humble. We'll play by the rules in the country. We'll be American in America. And we don't think that we are in a position to even position ourselves as a prime. We're happy to work with US primes. We're happy to work with each and every one of them. We have technology to bring to the table. We have European developments that we're happy to bring to the US. Maybe some of those developments are unique. If I look at OneWeb and the factory that we've created in Florida, the ability to introduce principles of large mass production and derive the costs accordingly is something that we were happy to bring to the US. But our positioning is clearly to supply the US primes, but not to dream of competing with US primes.
Just to pick up on that, I mean, we hear this question a lot from our clients, and our recommendation tends to be that there are plenty of primes that the U.S. government can turn to that have the relationships, the clearances, the integration capability, but there's so much changing in small sat manufacturing, in optical satellite links, in U frequencies, V-band, W-band being deployed, that you can create a lot of value as a trusted sub to a very strong prime without having to upset the normalcy that is relying on a quote-unquote American prime contractor for that. But there's a lot of room, and I think about OneWeb right now, and I think about the capabilities that were brought with Surrey in that acquisition 10, 12 years ago, and how that's rolled into small sat capabilities and quantum and some of the other things. And some of the capabilities that Thales brought by building Iridium and the original O3B and things. So there are a lot of capabilities out there that benefit the US government and their mission that can be of great value, and you see it a lot more in civil, obviously, but that bring a lot of value and that don't need to be, if you don't aspire to prime, you'll probably save yourself a lot of energy, but you aspire to add value and start in civil because that's always easier than military.
Is there anything you'd like to add here?
I would just add, I won't go too deep because that gets a little bit more into the acquisition realm and beyond my expertise, but I would offer a trend that that I think you should think of when looking forward in this area, and it is where are the other domains? How do they handle this? So air, land, and sea, and if you see that they handle this differently than space, I think you're going to see a trend towards space being more normalized. If you look at space, air, land, and sea, and you see all of them handle it a common way, which is different than what you're saying, then it's almost a broader acquisition issue that needs to be addressed. So first seeing if it's a space issue, and if it's a space issue, my sense is we'll see a trend towards more normalization.
Okay, we have time for one more question.
Right here, thank you. So, I am the aforementioned Steve Grunman, the senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council, the producer of the Defense Industrial Policy Series. I want to both steal the last question, but before I do, thank all of you for coming, including those of you who are watching the live stream. Appreciate it very much. Needless to say, I want to thank this terrific panel, Mr. Scott Pace, who spoke before him, and not least our moderator, Jacqueline Felcher. Thank you all very, very much. I think this was at best a mere kickoff to attention that I hope we here at the Atlantic Council hope will be given with greater vigor to this topic. Here's the question I want to offer, and perhaps each of the panelists, and Jacqueline, even if you yourself want to weigh in on it, to close us out at the end of the program this evening. Competitors sometimes share the same value or object, but partners are able to bring some sort of complementarity, synergy, as it's sometimes called, to working together as opposed to in competition with one another. I'd be interested in each of your perspectives on the question of what is that complementarity between the U.S. and Europe, or synergy, if you will. The thing that the one is good at either by dint of some states of nature, their geography, for example, or their the particular orientation of their industry and technology. Are there particular synergies and complementarities between the U.S. and Europe that would form maybe an agenda of low-hanging fruit, right? Because we really need one another in respect to those things. That's my closing question for the panel. And then once again, when they're done, if we would give them all a big round of applause, I would appreciate it.
Would you like to start? We can just go right down the line.
I was hoping to hear the other end first, but I'll be happy to go first. I guess I would just raise it up to a broader level of, really that synergy is at its most macro level, those shared values and that shared vision of which we do have that strength that offers the opportunity for the partnership, particularly of a common defense as we look across NATO and those allies across the transatlantic. So, and that needs to transcend to space, and we need to work that with much more vigor. So that's how I would answer, but maybe at the end I'll have a few more additional thoughts.
Okay, thank you for the handover. There's been lots of talk lately, or for the last 1 or 2 years in the US about the $1 trillion economy that the growth of space activities is going to generate. And that's one area where, if you look at the way the US and the historical space actors from Europe look not only at space, but generally at the way they approach the economy, society, and the values they share. I'm with Stephen where we say this is an area where we can work together and make sure that we create the conditions for all of us to compete and cooperate in this space to create the $1 trillion economy for everybody.
It's not the easiest question, but I think I would answer on two levels. First one, when you ask kids what are they interested in, invariably, wherever you are in the world, they'll answer dinosaurs and space. Dinosaurs is a thing of the past, space is a thing for the future. And through education and generating the future talents, we can also start at this level to cooperate and to have talents crossing the pond. On program sides, in essence, a lot of what we're doing in space is of dual use. And the chance that we have with the renewed interest to go back to the moon, to go further to Mars, is something where we have concrete programs where the US and Europe can really cooperate, and where companies like Airbus and Lockheed Martin, for example, on the Orion program, are cooperating, and we're looking forward to more.
See, I'd answer your question and yes to a lot of the things you're talking about. So geography, yes. It's a really important thing. If you're looking at, getting more sources of data, critically important, and Europe has some phenomenal systems. If you're looking at resiliency, you talked about it before, GPS, getting multiple signals helps out in a resiliency standpoint, and having those systems be share information and interoperability would be important for that resiliency. If you're looking at technology, machine learning, analytics, AI, there's just not enough research dollars going into that, and that's really where the next competition is going to be, right? Is whose systems can predictive analytics faster than the next one, and basically get that whole loop. So I was just at a space domain awareness conference a few weeks ago. A lot of good research going on in Europe right now. Could use all of that stuff. So clearly we're looking for partnerships and ways to be able to take that technology and apply it towards this new domain.
Yeah, I guess the only thing to add, I think it's a great point, is if we take the existence of current complementarity in the transatlantic, Canada, US over to Europe, there's a lot of it going on now. And it's very effective and very good. It happens across the board. Maybe one area, just to pick up on resiliency, is if we are doing a better job at co-reliance, not saying that the US is better at this and Europe's better at that, because there are examples of the US being better at a lot and Europe being better at a lot. And it's really about a shared vision for our shared economic and national security, and building in the foundation to be resilient in that, in the supply chain, government to government. So designing resiliency into national security missions that we both will have to rely on if, in a threat situation. And then also thinking about relying on commercial dual use, as Laurent was saying, being less doctrinaire about relying on military assets and being more open to involving commercial on both sides of the Atlantic, picking up on whether it's prime or sub, but relying on capabilities and technologies and assets. So if you have satellites spread out that are commercial, that are backups to government satellites, it's very hard to take out a government satellite and know that you've cost your adversary that mission. So it's about that redundancy, that resiliency, both government to government and government to commercial.
Right. Thank you again to our panel for being here, and thank you to the Atlantic Council again for organizing, and to everyone both here and online for tuning in. And if the audience could please just stay in their seats while the panel leaves, that would be fantastic.